They called them turtles made of iron, slow, ugly, and doomed to sink before they fired a single shot. But on a frozen February morning in 1862, those turtles awakened on the Tennessee River and changed the face of naval warfare forever. The awakening of the Leviathan. When the Mississippi Valley witnessed the birth of modern naval warfare. The dawn of February 6, 1862, arrived over the Tennessee River wrapped in thick fog and freezing air that burned the lungs of Union sailors, stationed on the decks of the strangest vessels that had ever navigated American waters. From Cairo, Illinois, a tremendous flotilla advanced upriver, 7 giants of iron and wood that Navy veterans observed with a mixture of skepticism and uneasy fascination. These were the City-class gunboats, each christened with the name of Midwestern cities: Cairo, Carondelet, Cincinnati, Louisville, Mound City, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. Sailors accustomed to the elegant wooden sailing ships of the traditional Navy looked at these monsters, 175 feet in length, with their angular casemates covered by 2.5-inch iron plates, and muttered doubts. How could something so heavy, so slow, so grotesque survive the hell of fire that awaited them upriver? Commander Andrew Hull Foote, a veteran of 40 years of naval service, watched from the bridge of his flagship Cincinnati as black smoke from the boilers mixed with the morning fog. He knew that in the coming hours, in the freezing waters near Fort Henry, these doubts would be answered with gunpowder and iron. The Confederacy had bet everything on geography. General Albert Sidney Johnston, commander of Confederate Department No. 2, understood that control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers was the key to holding Kentucky, Tennessee, and the entire Mississippi Valley. In May 1861, when the war was still young and many believed it would last only months, Confederate engineers began constructing a defensive line based on river fortifications. Fort Henry, erected on the eastern bank of the Tennessee, and Fort Donelson, 12 miles east on the Cumberland, would form an impenetrable barrier. Or so it seemed. Fort Henry was no masterpiece of military engineering. Built on low ground subject to seasonal flooding, its 17 heavy cannons included captured and improvised pieces. But General Lloyd Tillman, commander of the garrison, trusted that the combination of artillery positioned on high ground and the navigation difficulties of the Tennessee would make any naval attack suicidal against his defenses. The Confederacy had learned from European lessons. Land fortifications always defeated wooden ships, but these were no ordinary wooden vessels. The ironclad gunboats now advancing against Fort Henry represented a revolution conceived in the creative minds of civil engineers, transformed into architects of war. James Buchanan Eads, a St. Louis engineer without formal military training, had received a War Department contract in August 1861 to build 7 river ironclads in just 65 days, a deadline that naval officers considered impossible. Eads, who knew the Mississippi like few others, designed vessels specific to river warfare. Shallow draft of 6 feet to navigate shallow waters, stern paddle wheel propulsion for precise maneuvers, and most importantly, armor concentrated on the bow and flanks where they would face enemy fire. Each gunboat carried 13 cannons of various calibers, including 8- and 9-inch pieces capable of firing 64-pound projectiles. The total cost of the flotilla reached $892,000, a fortune for the time. Skeptics abounded. Naval officers trained in the tradition of Nelson and Farragut looked at those flat hulls, angular casemates, and disproportionate smokestacks as aberrations. How could they maneuver under fire? How would crews accustomed to sails and rigging operate steam machinery in combat? Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, commander of the Mississippi Squadron, had called them stupid turtles. But General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of the Cairo district, saw in them the key to his campaign. When the Cincinnati led the formation upriver that freezing morning, Grant watched from a transport at the rear, anxious. His plan was perfect coordination between naval and land forces. While Foote bombarded the fort, 15,000 Union soldiers would land to encircle the garrison. But torrential rains had transformed roads into swamps, delaying the ground advance. At 11:30 in the morning, Foote decided he could not wait. The 7 gunboats would form in 2 lines, 4 armored in the vanguard: Essex, Cincinnati, Carondelet, In St. Louis, 3 wooden gunboats in the second line, Conestoga, Tyler, and Lexington. The distance to the fort was 1.5 miles when the first Confederate shots echoed through the fog that was beginning to dissipate. The firing began at 12:10 in the afternoon. Confederate 10-inch cannon projectiles began raising columns of water around the vessels advancing implacably. At 1,700 yards distance, Union sailors could see the orange flames of enemy cannons, feel the pressure of nearby explosions that made the hulls vibrate, but they continued forward. Captain William "Dirty Bill" Porter, commanding the Essex, maintained constant speed while counting impacts on the armor. The noise was infernal, metal against metal, the whistle of projectiles ricocheting, the shouts of orders competing with the roar of boilers working at maximum pressure. At 1,000 yards, Foote ordered the gunboats to return fire. 13 cannons per vessel multiplied by 7 meant 91 pieces of artillery concentrated against 17 Confederate cannons. The mathematics were favorable, but the physics were not. The vessels swayed with the recoil, making precise aim difficult, while Confederate gunners fired from stable platforms. The duel continued for 40 minutes of growing intensity. Confederate projectiles found their targets repeatedly. Records show 32 direct hits on the 4 main armored gunboats, but most ricocheted off the inclined plates or embedded without penetrating completely. Then, at 12:50, luck changed dramatically. A 128-pound Confederate projectile from the 10-inch Columbiad cannon struck the Essex in the forward casemate, penetrating the armor exactly where steam from the boilers was channeled. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. Superheated steam at 300 degrees Fahrenheit instantly filled the interior of the vessel. Sailors were cooked alive where they stood, skin peeling away, lungs burning with the first inhalation. William Porter was thrown against the hull, his body severely burned but maintaining sufficient consciousness to shout orders, while the Essex, uncontrolled, began drifting downriver. 28 men died within minutes. Some threw themselves into the freezing water, preferring drowning to the agony of steam. Sailors on the other gunboats watched horrified as the Essex, still steaming, moved away from the battle line. The skeptics seemed to be right. The Ironclads were death traps. But Foote did not retreat. The 3 remaining gunboats advanced to 600 yards, suicidal distance according to all naval manuals of the era. The Cincinnati, Carondelet, and St. Louis poured concentrated fire on the casemates of Fort Henry, while Confederate projectiles hammered their armor. The noise was deafening. The thunder of cannons, the roar of explosions, the metallic whistle of impacts, the screams of the wounded. Black smoke covered the river, making it impossible to see beyond a few yards. Gunners worked mechanically. Load, aim, fire, recoil with the recoil, in suffocating heat inside the iron casemates that transformed into furnaces with constant fire. Then, at 1:10, 60 minutes after the bombardment began, something extraordinary happened. The Confederate flag lowered from the mainmast of Fort Henry. Sudden silence descended over the river as smoke slowly dissipated. General Tilghman, realizing his defenses were destroyed and knowing that Grant's infantry was hours from arriving, surrendered the fort. When Union officers disembarked, they found devastation. Of the 17 Confederate cannons, only 4 remained operational. The rest were dismounted with destroyed carriages or irreparably damaged pieces. 5 Confederate soldiers lay dead, 11 wounded. Surprisingly light casualties considering the intensity of the bombardment. Tilghman's garrison, approximately 100 men, had been captured intact. The rest, nearly 3,000 soldiers, he had wisely evacuated to Fort Donelson before the siege could be completed. But the strategic result was undeniable. For the first time in history, a naval flotilla purely with firepower had defeated an established land fortification without significant ground troop support. Veteran sailors who had doubted the Ironclads now observed the damaged but victorious gunboats with new respect. The Cincinnati had suffered 31 impacts but remained operational. The St. Louis received 7 direct hits without casualties. Only the Essex, with its catastrophic explosion, had suffered significant losses, but that had been a design accident, not a failure of the armor concept. News of the victory electrified the North. Newspapers proclaimed the birth of a new era in naval warfare. The New York Times devoted the front page, "River Fortresses Demonstrate Impotence Against Modern Naval Power." But the significance went beyond headlines. Fort Henry opened the Tennessee River to Union navigation all the way to Muscle Shoals in Alabama, 200 miles of penetration into the Confederate heartland. More importantly, it demonstrated that Johnston's strategy of defense based on river fortifications was fatally flawed against adequate technology. 12 days later, on February 16th, Grant would capture Fort Donelson in a combined operation, forcing Confederate evacuation of Nashville and Kentucky. The defensive line that was supposed to protect the Mississippi Valley had disintegrated in weeks. The impact on military doctrine was profound. Before Fort Henry, conventional European wisdom prevailed. Coastal or river fortifications were practically invulnerable to naval attacks. The Battle of Alexandria in 1807, the bombardment of Algiers in 1816, the attack on Sevastopol in 1854, all confirmed the superiority of land artillery over wooden vessels. But iron changed the equation. The 2.5-inch armor plates, though primitive by standards that would come, proved sufficient against Confederate artillery. More importantly, concentration of fire, 91 pieces against 17, allowed volume that overwhelmed the individual accuracy of Confederate gunners. Military engineers began redesigning fortifications considering the threat of ironclads. The Confederacy, desperately, would accelerate programs to build its own armored vessels. The technological revolution represented by these ironclads extended far beyond simple addition of armor plates to river vessels. Each city-class gunboat was a complex marriage of multiple emerging technologies, a synthesis of industrial capability that only the North's manufacturing base could produce at scale. The vessels displaced 512 tons when fully loaded, requiring coal bunkers capable of holding 75 tons of fuel for the steam engines that drove paddle wheels 22 feet in diameter. The engines themselves, massive constructions of cast iron and brass, generated sufficient power to push these ungainly vessels at speeds approaching 9 knots in favorable current, though more typically they managed 6 knots in combat conditions. The casemates, those distinctive sloped structures that gave the ironclads their characteristic silhouette, were engineering marvels in their own right. Railroad iron, rolled into plates and fastened to oak backing 24 inches thick, created composite armor that distributed the kinetic energy of impact across broader areas than simple iron plate alone could manage. The angle of slope, carefully calculated by Eads and his team, encouraged projectiles to glance off rather than penetrate directly, a principle that would be rediscovered and refined in tank armor design decades later. The armament configuration reflected hard-won lessons from early river engagements and coastal bombardments. The 13 guns carried by each vessel were not uniformly distributed, but carefully positioned to maximize fields of fire while minimizing exposure. 3 guns faced forward through ports in the bow casemate, 4 on each broadside, and 2 aft. This arrangement allowed the vessels to bring significant firepower to bear while approaching fortifications bow on, presenting the smallest possible target profile. The mix of gun types, from 32-pound smoothbores to 8-inch and 9-inch rifles, provided flexibility in engagement. Smoothbores, with their shorter range but higher rate of fire, proved effective at close quarters where accuracy was less critical than volume of fire. The rifled guns, though slower to load, could reach out to greater distances with improved accuracy, useful for engaging shore batteries before closing to decisive range. The gun crews, many of them former merchant sailors or even soldiers with minimal naval training, learned their deadly craft through constant drill during the voyage downriver from Cairo. Loading and firing a heavy naval gun in the confined space of an iron casemate, with poor ventilation and smoke from previous discharges still lingering, required coordination and discipline that only repetition could instill. The human dimension of these technological marvels deserves equal attention to the machinery and armor. Each gunboat carried a crew of approximately 175 men, a polyglot mixture of regular Navy sailors, merchant marine volunteers, and Army personnel temporarily assigned to naval duty. The conditions aboard during combat were almost unimaginable. The interior temperature of the casemates during sustained firing could reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit, the iron walls conducting heat from the boilers below and retaining heat from gun discharges. Men worked stripped to the waist, their bodies blackened with powder residue, eyes streaming tears from the acrid smoke, throats parched from shouting orders over the cacophony of battle. The shallow draft that made these vessels ideal for river navigation also made them unstable gun platforms, rolling and pitching with even modest river currents or the wake of other vessels. Accuracy suffered accordingly, but the concentration of fire partially compensated. When 7 gunboats fired simultaneously at a single target, even poor accuracy meant multiple hits. The psychological impact on the receiving end of such bombardment cannot be understated. The cumulative effect of hundreds of shells landing within a confined defensive position over the course of an hour would break the morale of all but the most determined defenders. The Confederate perspective on the engagement reveals the shock and adaptation that characterized military innovation during the Civil War. General Tilghman, a West Point graduate who had distinguished himself in the Mexican War, understood fortification design according to the principles taught at the academy and practiced in conflicts around the world. His placement of artillery at Fort Henry followed conventional wisdom: position heavy guns to command approaches, create overlapping fields of fire, and trust in the inherent advantage of stable platforms over mobile ones. The 17 guns under his command included a remarkable variety of ordnance: 10-inch Columbiads, capable of throwing 128-pound shot, 8-inch siege howitzers, rifled 32-pounders, and even some ancient 42-pounders of questionable reliability. Ammunition was less standardized than Union supplies, mixing solid shot, explosive shell, and case shot, depending on what the Ordnance Department in Nashville could provide. Tillman's gunners, unlike their Union counterparts, were largely experienced artillerists drawn from Tennessee and Kentucky militia companies, men who knew their weapons and could service them efficiently. They opened fire at 1,700 yards, the maximum effective range of their heaviest pieces, and initially their accuracy was impressive. Confederate observers noted hits on the Union vessels with satisfaction, seeing iron plates buckle and hearing the satisfying clang of solid shot striking home. But as the range closed and the Union gunboats continued their advance despite taking hits, unease spread through the Confederate gun crews. The psychology of the engagement tilted inexorably against the defenders as they realized their best shots were not stopping the enemy. When the Ironclads reached 1,000 yards and began returning fire in earnest, the character of the battle transformed. The fort's earthwork and masonry construction, adequate against wooden vessels or infantry assault, proved vulnerable to the weight of metal the Union gunboats could throw. 9-inch shells weighing 80 pounds crashed into embrasures, dismounting guns and killing crews. The fort's magazine, dangerously exposed and inadequately protected, became a liability as near misses sent showers of earth and debris cascading over the powder stocks. Tilghman, standing on the parapet to observe the battle and direct fire, saw clearly that his position was untenable. The terrain disadvantages of Fort Henry, built on low ground and partly flooded by recent rains, meant that several guns could not be brought to bear effectively. Water stood in some of the lower emplacements, making service of the pieces difficult and dampening powder charges. The combination of technological disadvantage, terrain weakness, and overwhelming firepower left him no option but surrender or senseless sacrifice of his garrison. The immediate aftermath of Fort Henry's fall sent shockwaves through Confederate command structure. General Johnston, upon receiving word of the defeat, understood that his entire defensive strategy for the Western theater was compromised. The loss of Fort Henry meant Union gunboats could range freely up the Tennessee River, striking deep into Alabama and threatening the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, the vital east-west supply line of the Confederacy. More immediately, Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, now exposed on its flank, would be the next target. Johnston faced an agonizing choice: concentrate forces to defend Donelson, risking encirclement and destruction of his field army, or evacuate Tennessee entirely and fall back to a more defensible line further south. The political implications of abandoning Tennessee were staggering. Nashville was the first Confederate state capital. Its loss would be a tremendous blow to Southern morale. Yet military reality could not be ignored. The Ironclads had demonstrated a capability that Johnston's engineers had assured him was impossible. They could defeat prepared fortifications with naval gunfire alone. This fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of river defense. Every fort, every battery along the Cumberland, Tennessee, and Mississippi rivers now seemed vulnerable to these iron monsters. The Union High Command recognized the significance immediately, though appreciation of the Ironclads' potential had been slow to develop. General Henry Halleck, commander of the Department of the Missouri, had initially resisted the Navy's requests for support of the Ironclad program, viewing gunboats as expensive distractions from the main business of raising and equipping field armies. The Navy itself had been ambivalent, old-line officers viewing river warfare as a sideshow unworthy of the service's traditions. But Fort Henry changed minds with the finality of cannon fire. Within days of the victory, Halleck was writing to Washington requesting expansion of the river flotilla, praising the gunboats in terms he had previously reserved for his own ground forces. The Navy Department, which had transferred the river squadron to Army control in 1861, due to lack of interest, now sought to reclaim authority over these vessels that had proven so effective. Bureaucratic battles over command and control of the Western flotilla would continue for months, but the operational reality was clear. The Ironclads were the key to Union advance in the Western theater. Foote himself, recovering from minor wounds received during the action, immediately began planning the next phase of operations. Fort Donelson would be a harder nut to crack. Positioned on higher ground with better fields of fire and a stronger garrison, it would not succumb as readily as Henry had. But the commander's confidence in his Ironclads had been vindicated. The damage assessment of his vessels after the action showed the effectiveness of the armor scheme. Of the 32 hits recorded on the 4 lead gunboats, only 11 had actually penetrated the casemates, and most of those had been at the waterline where armor was thinnest, or at the pilot house where vision slits created weak points. The exception was the catastrophic hit on Essex's steam pipe, but that was recognized as a design flaw that could be corrected in future construction. Eads was already incorporating lessons learned into the next generation of river ironclads, vessels that would be even more formidable than the City-class boats that had proven the concept. The naval constructor was designing vessels with heavier armor, more powerful engines, and improved crew protection, benefiting from the hard-won knowledge purchased with blood and iron at Fort Henry. The strategic exploitation of Fort Henry's capture demonstrated the mobility advantages that river control provided. Within days, Union gunboats were ranging far up the Tennessee, reaching as far as Florence, Alabama, destroying Confederate supplies, cutting railroad bridges, and spreading panic through regions that had felt secure behind Johnston's river defense line. The psychological impact on Southern civilians was profound. Suddenly the war, which had seemed safely distant for many in the Tennessee Valley, was literally at their doorsteps. Confederate authorities struggled to respond, lacking both the industrial base to produce equivalent ironclads and the strategic reserves to garrison every potential landing point along hundreds of miles of riverbank. The Union's combination of mobility, firepower, and logistical superiority became overwhelming. Grant's armies could be supplied and reinforced via the rivers that the gunboats controlled, while Confederate forces were forced to rely on railroads that were increasingly vulnerable to Union raids. The Confederacy's interior lines advantage, so important in Virginia, where rail connections were relatively secure, counted for less in the West, where river navigation provided Union forces with equally good or better mobility. The technological lessons of Fort Henry rippled outward to influence naval design and doctrine far beyond the Tennessee River. Naval architects in both North and South carefully studied reports from the engagement, seeking to understand what had worked and what had failed. The Confederate Navy, desperately short of resources and facilities, prioritized construction of ironclads over traditional wooden warships, recognizing that armor was essential for survival in the new naval environment. The CSS Virginia, already under construction at Norfolk from the salvaged hulk of USS Merrimack, represented a parallel development of the ironclad concept for coastal waters. When Virginia sortied against the Union blockading squadron at Hampton Roads on March 8, 1862, just a month after Fort Henry, she would demonstrate in saltwater what the City-class gunboats had proven in fresh. Wooden warships were obsolete in the age of iron. The Union response, USS Monitor, represented yet another approach to ironclad design, with her revolutionary rotating turret and extremely low freeboard. The epic duel between Virginia and Monitor on March 9th would capture public imagination and newspaper headlines, but in many ways, Fort Henry had already settled the fundamental question of ironclad viability. The subsequent naval arms race between North and South, each side striving to build more and better armored vessels, grew directly from the lessons learned on the Tennessee River that February morning. The human cost of the ironclad revolution, particularly the tragedy aboard Essex, drove improvements in crew protection and damage control that would save countless lives in subsequent actions. The steam pipe rupture that killed 28 men was a preventable disaster, the result of routing high-pressure steam lines through spaces where shell hits were likely. Naval architects redesigned steam systems in later vessels to minimize vulnerable runs, add redundancy, and incorporate isolation valves that could contain pressure loss to single compartments. Medical services aboard the gunboats, initially minimal, expanded to include dedicated surgeon spaces with proper lighting and ventilation. Recognition that treating wounded in the chaos of battle required preparation and resources. The development of combat medicine in the Union Navy owed much to the hard lessons learned aboard vessels like Essex, where men died not from the initial injury, but from shock, infection, or inability to provide timely treatment in cramped, hot, smoke-filled casemates. Survivor accounts from the Essex disaster provided valuable data on steam scalding injuries, informing treatment protocols that would be applied throughout the war and beyond. The recognition that industrial warfare created new categories of wounds and trauma, different from traditional battle injuries, emerged in part from the experiences of river ironclad crews. The economic dimensions of the ironclad program deserve examination as well. The $892,000 spent on the initial 7 City-class gunboats represented a significant investment for the Union, equivalent to roughly $30 million in modern terms, when adjusted for inflation and relative economic scale. Each vessel cost approximately $127,000, more expensive than a regiment of infantry for a year, but far less than the cost of a major field army. The return on this investment, measured in military effectiveness and strategic results, proved exceptional. The capture of Fort Henry, and subsequently Fort Donelson, the opening of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and the eventual fall of Nashville and much of Tennessee yielded territorial and economic gains worth millions of dollars in direct terms and incalculable value in strategic position. The Confederacy, by contrast, struggled to match Union naval spending despite desperate need. Limited industrial capacity, scarcity of iron and skilled labor, and the demands of equipping field armies meant that Southern ironclad programs were perpetually underfunded and behind schedule. The CSS Arkansas, one of the few Confederate river ironclads completed and put into service, cost approximately $160,000 and required nearly a year to build, demonstrating the resource constraints that plagued Southern naval efforts throughout the war. This disparity in industrial and financial capability, starkly revealed by the ironclad competition, reflected broader Northern advantages that would ultimately prove decisive. The cultural and psychological impact of Fort Henry extended into public consciousness in both North and South. For the Union, the victory provided a much-needed boost to morale after months of frustration and limited success. The disaster at Bull Run in July 1861 had shattered illusions of a short war. Subsequent months had brought inconclusive skirmishing and a growing realization that the conflict would be long and costly. Fort Henry represented the first significant Union victory, demonstrating that Northern technological and industrial superiority could be translated into battlefield success. Newspapers celebrated Foote and his ironclads, artists produced lithographs showing the gunboats in action, and recruitment offices reported increased enlistments. The message was clear. The Union could win. Modern weapons and Northern ingenuity would prevail over Southern military tradition. For the Confederacy, Fort Henry was a sobering reminder of material disadvantages that romantic notions of martial valor could not overcome. Southern newspapers attempted to minimize the defeat, blaming flooding, inadequate preparation, and bad luck rather than acknowledging the technological superiority of Union forces. But thoughtful Confederate observers recognized the implications. The South's hope of achieving independence through defensive warfare, making the cost of conquest too high for the North to bear, depended on the ability to hold strategic points and defend territory. If river fortifications could not stop Union advances, if ironclads could sweep aside defensive works that should have been impregnable, then the entire defensive strategy was compromised. This psychological shift, the recognition that technology was changing warfare faster than doctrine could adapt, influenced Confederate strategy throughout the war. The lessons of Fort Henry found application in subsequent river campaigns that methodically dismantled Confederate defenses throughout the Mississippi Valley. Island Number 10, a fortified position on the Mississippi River considered even stronger than Fort Henry, fell to Union forces in April 1862 after ironclads demonstrated that they could run past shore batteries with acceptable losses. Memphis fell in June after a river battle that saw Union ironclads destroy the Confederate river defense fleet. Vicksburg, the strongest fortress on the Mississippi, endured nearly a year of siege and bombardment, falling finally in July 1863 in campaign, where Union gunboats played essential supporting roles. Port Hudson, the last Confederate stronghold on the river, surrendered shortly after Vicksburg, completing Union control of the Mississippi and effectively splitting the Confederacy. In each of these campaigns, the principles established at Fort Henry held true. Concentration of ironclad firepower, combined with ground forces and sustained operations, could reduce fortifications that previous generations of military engineers had considered impregnable. The River Flotilla, expanded from the original 7 gunboats to more than 50 vessels of various types by war's end, became the Union's strategic advantage in the Western theater, the key that unlocked Confederate defenses and opened invasion routes into the Southern heartland. The evolution of ironclad design during the war years shows how rapidly military technology advanced under the pressure of conflict. The City-class gunboats that fought at Fort Henry were first-generation vessels, designed and built with imperfect knowledge and limited time. Their weaknesses became apparent through combat experience: insufficient armor at the waterline, vulnerable steam systems, poor ventilation, limited fields of fire for bow guns. Subsequent designs addressed these flaws. The Milwaukee-class monitors, built specifically for river service, incorporated 11-inch Dahlgren guns in rotating turrets, providing all-around fire capability without need to maneuver the entire vessel. Armor thickness increased to 6 inches in critical areas, though this made vessels slower and more difficult to maneuver in confined river channels. The Neosho-class monitors, completed near war's end, represented the culmination of river ironclad development. Well-armored, heavily armed, reasonably fast, and equipped with all the lessons learned from 3 years of river warfare. These vessels never saw the combat their predecessors endured. The Confederacy having lost control of the western rivers by the time they were commissioned, but they represented the technological endpoint of a development arc that began with the crude but effective City-class boats. International observers paid close attention to American river ironclad operations, recognizing that lessons learned in the Mississippi Valley had applicability to riverine and coastal warfare worldwide. British naval authorities, initially dismissive of American naval innovations, reconsidered their positions after studying reports from Fort Henry and subsequent actions. The Royal Navy had been building coastal defense ironclads since the late 1850s, but these were sea-going vessels designed for different operational parameters. The American experience demonstrated that purpose-built shallow-draft armored vessels could be highly effective in riverine environments, opening possibilities for imperial policing actions and operations in regions where traditional naval vessels could not operate. French observers drew similar conclusions, influencing designs for their own coastal defense ironclads and the development of naval doctrine for riverine operations in Indochina and other colonial possessions. Russian naval authorities, dealing with extensive river systems and coastal waters too shallow for deep-draft vessels, found American ironclad experience particularly relevant. The global diffusion of ironclad technology and river warfare doctrine, accelerated by the American Civil War, represented a genuine revolution in military affairs, changing how nations thought about naval power projection and coastal defense. The legacy of Fort Henry and the ironclads that fought there extends into the modern era in ways both direct and subtle. The principle that armor, firepower, and mobility could be combined to create weapon systems capable of defeating static defenses, became foundational to 20th century warfare. Tanks, the dominant weapons of ground warfare from 1918 onward, were in many respects the land equivalents of river ironclads, armored vehicles carrying heavy guns, capable of maneuver and designed to break through defensive positions that infantry alone could not overcome. The operational concepts developed for coordinating ironclad operations with ground forces prefigured combined arms doctrine that would characterize modern warfare. Aircraft carriers, the capital ships of World War II and beyond, inherited from the Civil War ironclads the principle that the platform matters less than the weapons it carries and the doctrine governing its employment. Strategic bombing campaigns, amphibious operations, and naval gunfire support missions all trace intellectual lineage to lessons learned in the Mississippi Valley during the Civil War. The specific technologies changed radically, but the fundamental principles of concentration, mobility, and combined arms established by Foote and his gunboats remained valid. Fort Henry stands as a pivotal moment when skepticism gave way to acceptance, when tradition yielded to innovation, when the impossible became merely difficult. Sailors who could not believe in ironclads with 12 guns, who muttered that such vessels were floating coffins doomed to fail, watched as those same vessels systematically reduced fortifications that conventional wisdom held to be impregnable. The river fortresses sank one by one, not because the concept was wrong, but because technology had evolved beyond the capacity of static defenses to resist. In that cold February dawn on the Tennessee River, as fog lifted and ironclads advanced against prepared positions, the 19th century gave way to the 20th. The age of wooden walls and Nelsonian tactics ended in smoke and thunder, replaced by the age of steam, iron, and industrial warfare. Those who witnessed Fort Henry understood, even if they could not fully articulate it, that they had seen the future. It was loud, dirty, dangerous, and utterly transformative. The Leviathans of iron had awakened, and naval warfare would never be the same. This is the story of how 7 strange gunboats, built in a rush by civilians, defied every rule of war and brought down a Confederate fortress that was supposed to be untouchable. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, if you were a sailor back then, would you have trusted these iron monsters or stayed on the wooden ships you knew? Now let's go back to the morning when the river itself began to roar.